You first met Baz right here on Dutch the Podcast, talking about his incredible bike store, GoDutch.ca. Hi, Baz.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Good, man. Maybe you could answer a couple of questions for our audience, seeing as you are a participating sponsor of today's show. Thank you very much. But I want people to understand a little bit about what you do. What bikes do you sell?
Hey, I sell the real Dutch bikes, authentic Dutch bikes. And if for people that are looking for that real Dutch feel, I'd say come by my bike shop this summer and pick up your authentic new or used Dutch bike before we sell out. You can buy online or in store. Online would be www.godutch.ca.
Awesome commuter bikes. If you are looking for a long-lasting, quality-built bike right from the Netherlands, GoDutch.ca is the place to go. GoDutch.ca. Thanks, Baz.
Thanks, Mike.
Hi, and welcome to Dutch the Podcast. My name is Mike. As always, I am joined by publisher extraordinaire of Dutch the Magazine, Mokum Publishing, and of course, executive producer and host of Dutch the Podcast, Tom Byfoot. How are you?
I am great, Mike. Great to see you. Great to hear your voice. Looking forward to our 12th episode that we're recording today.
I mean, in broadcast terms, that's a season. Congratulations. And by the way, thank you to everybody who has supported the show, the sponsors that came on board, and the people that believed in getting it up and running. The response has been amazing, and so thanks very much.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that as well. It's been great hearing the feedback on the various different podcasts we've done, and we've had a great number of very varied guests on the show so far, and I promise you, Mike, today is going to be different again. We're going to be covering a topic that we haven't really delved into before.
I'll get you to introduce our guest today. First, let me just remind you, if you are not subscribed, please do so. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, and you'll be notified every time a new episode arrives. In the meantime, if you wanted to reach out to us, I would also encourage you to do that. We love your comments, and you can do that by getting in touch with us at dutchthemedia.com. All right. Well, without further ado, Tom, who are we speaking with this week?
Okay, so we have covered a number of aspects of Dutch immigration to North America, right? We've spoken about the 1840s immigration to Pella, Iowa. Mm-hmm. We've talked about the big 1950s immigration wave that happened after the war, which included the roots of the Krant, but we haven't really looked into that very first group of Dutch people that came to North America, and they came in the 1600s. As early as 1609, they sailed up the Hudson River by Manhattan Island, and the settlement developed there. That was probably the longest lasting of all the Dutch settlements in North America in terms of culture and language. It was called New Netherland, not New Netherlands, New Netherland. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing, but the Dutch language there and the Dutch customs survived for more than 200 years. And there's interviews with a guy in the 1950s, that's more than 300 years after the settlement started, who still spoke the 17th century Dutch that the settlers had brought over. So
that's incredible.
That's what we're going to be looking at. I visited the area outside of New York City, because everyone thinks New Amsterdam, New York City, that's where they settled. No, the settlement stretched much farther afield, and I visited the northern part of the Hudson Valley, around about Albany, the capital of New York. Albany was settled by the Dutch initially. A caveat there. There were indigenous people living there, and the funny thing is, just on a side note, often I get books for review in the magazine, and I received this book. I just picked it up at the post office, and it is very relevant. It's called Calvinists and Indians in the Northeastern Woodlands. And on the blurb on the back, it says, Stephen T. Staggs analyzes the impact of the Dutch Reformation upon the cross-cultural relations between those living in and around New Netherland And Stags shows that Native Americans and New Netherlanders hunted, smoked, ate, and drank together.
Wow.
And that's what this episode's about. We're not talking to Mr. Staggs. I think I'll reach out to him and see if we can get him on the podcast maybe a little later. No, we're talking to Peter Rose. Peter Rose, Stephen Staggs. He's an academic, so he's written an academic tome about the subject. Peter Rose is more of a popular author, and she focuses on the culinary history of New Netherland, the dishes and the customs that the Dutch brought with them when they settled in the Hudson Valley, where she lives herself. And she's written a number of books, but she's also, and we're very proud to have her on board. She's also published a good number of articles in Dutch the magazine. And I can talk about this for ages, but maybe the best way to deal with it is to listen to Peter Rose herself.
And here with that interview is our very own Tom.
To the show, I'm so excited to talk to you. I mean, you've written articles for Dutch the magazine, you've written many books, and you write about a topic that really interests me, which is the Dutch influence on New Netherland cuisine. Maybe you can start by briefly introducing yourself and tell us how you became interested in the Dutch influence on American cuisine.
Oh, well, I'd be glad to, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk about a topic I love. I worked for the Gannett newspapers as a food writer. I wrote mostly about family food, but we were located in the Hudson Valley. And at that time, which was sort of the early to middle 1980s, they historic Hudson Valley, which is an organization that administered historic houses and still does, had one of the houses from Cortland Manor started open hearth cooking classes. And my editor suggested I look into that since I talked about local food happenings. So I did. And while I was there, the curator asked me to look at an old Dutch book they had. And she said, "You're Dutch. Can you read this?" It turned out to be a very influential book for people who owned country houses. And it talked about their gardens, what they could grow in their gardens, how they could eat from their gardens. And it was so complete that it had a cookbook in the back. And I was, of course, very excited about the cookbook and actually spent several months transcribing it because it was so fragile. It couldn't be.
So how old was this cookbook, Peter?
This cookbook is called The Verstandige Kok. And I transcribed and then translated it into The Sensible Cook. And this was my first book on the subject.
So this is a 17th century book?
Yeah, it was first published in 1667.
Wow.
The edition I translated that was there was 1683, but it has the same recipes and it's the same book.
Wow. So that's how you started out getting interested in the subject. Now, maybe a briefly aside, you talk about the Hudson Valley. And of course, the Hudson Valley was settled by Dutch settlers. And including, of course, Manhattan and parts of New Jersey and Delaware, most of Delaware, that was called New Netherland. Now, can you maybe tell us a little bit about what New Netherland was and how the Dutch culture, language, and cooking methods survived after the English took it over in 1664?
Well, like you said, New Netherland was much bigger than just the Hudson Valley. It was present-day states, New York, New Jersey, parts of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. And the Dutch it was an area wedged between Virginia and New England. That's really important to realize. The Dutch settlers who came here came to trade with the Native Americans. Beaver skins is what they were after. And they also were there to provide any ships that would come to the shore to put food on board so they could go on and trade in the Atlantic, because the Dutch West India Company had gotten a trade agreement to trade in that area. And of course, later the Dutch were very active there. Now, why did the Dutch culture continue after the English took over? Part of it also has to do with the Dutch Reformed Church, where the preacher or the ministers preached in Dutch, and they continued to do so until well into the 18th century, yes. And so Dutch as a language was spoken, Dutch culture was continued. And I would love to tell you about the cookbooks I found where you can see that Dutch celebrations continued.
Yeah, we'll get to that, I think, Peter.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how long that Dutch culture did survive. I tell you, I visited the town of Kinderhook, where, of course, President Martin van Buren was born, and I got the chance to look up some of their old baptismal records, and they are kept in Dutch until almost 1800, 1797, and there are different towns up and down the valley, I guess, where that date would have been slightly different, but as late as the early 1800s, they were still using Dutch.
Yes, yes. And those records are another way of finding the Dutch culture continued.
Now, maybe backtrack a little bit. Can you tell us what was typical of Dutch cooking around the time that the cookbook that you talked about, De Verstandige Kok? Is it much different from what you'd find in the Netherlands now? What were their staples?
Well, their staples were bread. As of first, bread, the staff of life, bread accompanied every meal, and it was not as a sandwich, but very often it was used in cooking, for instance, in a porridge.
Okay.
The beautiful painting by Johannes Vermeer of the kitchen maid pouring milk in a dish, and there's crumbled bread in the foreground. You know she's got to put the bread and make a bread porridge. So,
Yeah, because you also did a lot of work on Golden Age painting and how food's represented in there, right?
absolutely, because they're full of information. Now, the Verstandige Kok was for people who could afford a country home. So that doesn't give us an idea of what the working class ate, but it was bread, um, porridge. They drank beer with every meal. So did the rich, if they or they had wine if it was available. Uh, so they ate simple foods. How the food differs from today is, of course, we have added in the early 1800s the potato.
Yeah, I was
And the
thinking about that. Yeah,
potato,
because that's a staple in the Netherlands now, of
yeah,
course, but
now
it came from the New World.
it sure did. But in the 17th century, when New Netherland was started, it was unknown. So bread was really the staple. And the Dutch, when they came here, brought with them their grains, their seeds, their tree stock. And I have a lovely story about them bringing their animals as well. So they try to recreate in New Netherland the life they knew in the homeland.
So tell me about the animals. What happened there?
In 1625, and coming up a 400th anniversary of the animal fleet, there was a ship called the Cow, the Horse, and the Sheep, and it transported the animals. And what's so special about it is that it was a ship designed to keep the animals safe. You can't put 100 animals loose in the bottom of a ship. They'll fall over
Oh,
when
yeah.
they have to travel in the ocean. No. Each animal was safely secured. It had a bunker with food in it and fresh water, and there were attendants to make sure the animals survived.
So the ships were designed specifically for transporting
Specifically for
animals.
animal transport, yes.
Wow.
Yes, it's amazing how organized that was.
So tell me, Peter. So they brought grains and seeds, and they brought domestic animals that they knew. But did the settlers also adapt their kitchen, their way of cooking, to what they found here? And I was also wondering, was there any influence from the indigenous cultures on the Dutch cooking?
Well, the main the main dish that immediately comes to mind is for the settlers in the Hudson Valley, in specifically saphan. Now, saphan was a dish of ground or pounded corn
Okay.
mixed with hot water. It was boiled into a porridge. Well, the Dutch, being used to porridge, could easily adapt that, and they did. And added, since they're a dairy country and they had the cows, milk to the dish and made it into their own porridge. Now, there is a lovely description by a man called Rufus Grider, who also could was an illustrator. It seemed he illustrates how the Dutch housewife had a large round dish and then made an indentation for each it was full of porridge, and then made an indentation for each person and milk was poured in that indentation. So you had your own little island of milk with walls of porridge. And he describes how people in the Mohawk Valley ate that kind of porridge at night well into the early 19th century. And he said the etiquette was that it was very impolite to break through your wall and get into your neighbor's milk.
Okay.
Anyway, so definitely that um, cornmeal mush dish was something the Dutch adapted. They ate squash and, of course, uh, became interested in all being agriculturalists. Farmers. They used what was available.
Wow.
And
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say, and they sowed their grain, particularly in the Albany area. It was wheat. Around Manhattan, it was more rye. But in the Albany area, they even used the bread that they had to exchange or barter with Native American who apparently loved the wheat bread. And there are ordinances that say people baked so much bread to trade that there wasn't enough left, grain left for the settlers. So there was an ordinance forbidding that kind of practice.
Wow. Yeah,
Food,
Albany was called Beaverwyck before the English took over, right? So they were
correct.
trading for beaver skins.
Yes. Beaverwyck, you know, means beaver area. So that's why it was named.
So, Peter, now you've also written extensively about the influence of that initial Dutch settlement on American cooking in general. Now, can you maybe talk about that a little bit? What still survives right now?
Well, what I think are the main items, and I have my list: waffles, wafers, pancakes, pretzels, cookies. Even the word cookie
Yeah.
became part of American English. You know, the British call what we call cookies biscuits. And um, a very obvious dish is coleslaw. Now, for the listeners, cole in Dutch is cabbage, slaw. So, cabbage salad. And we have a lovely description by a man named Peter Kamm, who was um, came here on behalf of Linnaeus to look at the local flora and fauna in
Yeah, Linnaeus being a famous Dutch botanist, of course, right?
Swedish,
Or
but
Swedish, sorry, but my
yes.
bad. Yeah.
uh, anyway, he came here and he kept an extensive diary, which has been made in a book called Peter Kamm's Travels in North America. And he describes coming to Albany and his Dutch landlady serving him coleslaw. And this is the wonderful thing. He describes its little shreds of cabbage mixed with melted butter and vinegar. Now, if you try your coleslaw the next time to make it like that, you'll never eat it any other way. It's
Okay.
so good. And
Okay.
hot butter to the cabbage, the shredded cabbage, it wilts, let it stand for an hour, and then serve it. just delicious.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm definitely going to try that. Now, Peter, you mentioned pancakes. So I cannot think of anything more typical of an American breakfast than flapjacks, than pancakes, right? Are those originally Dutch then as well?
Well, no, the American pancake changed after the introduction of baking powder and baking soda. Um, and but the original idea, other cultures had pancakes, of course, but the Dutch were particularly fond of them. And another item I haven't mentioned are oliekoeks, as they were called in the Netherlands, now called oliebollen. And here again, I think that oliekoeks are the forerunners of the American donut.
Oh,
Now,
yeah. Yeah, that
other
makes sense.
population groups, of course, knew also fried dough, but the Dutch, being so influential first settlers, I believe that their oliekoeks were the forerunners.
Forerunners of donuts, and again, that's one of those archetypical American foods that you can't imagine not existing right now. Peter, you alluded to the December festivities a little earlier on, and you wrote this amazing book called Delicious December, how the Dutch brought us Santa presents and treats. Um, can you tell us about the development of Santa Claus to Santa, and how that impacted cooking as well?
Excuse me.
No, it's okay. I
I
hope you're
hope
okay.
I can. The Dutch brought the custom of celebrating St. Nicholas as a children's feast, a kinderfeest here. And we know this because there is a baker's account book in which it is marked that Maria van Rensselaer in Albany ordered some Sinterklaas goed, meaning St. Nicholas stuff. So we know it was celebrated here, but we know it even more through the writings of Washington Irving. He wrote a historic spoof, The History of New York, and in it, he describes how St. Nicholas would come, ride over the roofs, draw magnificent presents from his breeches, and drop them down the chimney. That was the beginning of our Santa Claus. Now, I have noticed that when I say to an American Santa Claus, they think I say Santa Claus. It somehow seems to sound similarly. So his book was an enormous success, and other people chimed in. There is, of course, the poem of Clement Moore, A Visit from St. Nicholas, that helped progress this idea of Santa Claus. The illustrator Thomas Nast added the workshop in the North Pole and so forth. Other people embroidered on the idea. And the picture of Santa Claus in a red suit and being a jolly man smoking a Dutch pipe ultimately was really illustrated in a Coca Cola ad in the 1930s. Um, and we've been admiring and hoping for Santa Claus to come and bring us presents ever since.
But it came out of a tradition that is so strong in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Listen, Peter, I think, unfortunately, because it's fascinating and we should explore this maybe in a later episode again, but I think we're coming to the end now. One of the things I would like to ask you is, tell us, where can we find your books? And how many books have you written, and where can we find them if the listeners would like to purchase them?
Well, Amazon, of course, has them, and some of the local bookstores here in the Hudson Valley. If your listeners would like a signed copy, they can contact me through my website, peterrose.com. It's
peterrose.com.
.com.
Let's just repeat that once more. peterrose.com if they'd like to order a signed copy of one of your, how many books have you published?
10.
10.
I'm so proud to say that just before my 80th birthday, I finished the manuscript of the 10th book.
Oh, so you've just finished a new book?
Well, no, in 2019, just before the pandemic.
Okay. And what's that called?
That's called History on Our Plate.
And what's it about?
It is it describes Dutch culinary history, and it's full of historic recipes.
Wow. I can't look, I can't wait to, I'd love to see that. Peter, I'm going to come out to the Hudson Valley, I hope, sometime soon. You live there, right?
Yes.
Would love to come visit and talk more. And, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about a really fascinating subject.
Oh, thank you. I always enjoy talking about this.
I can tell. Well, thanks again, and talk to you later. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Fascinating interview, Tom. Peter Rose, and just a topic that reaches back into some roots into this settlement that the Dutch. Now, am I wrong about this, Tom? The Dutch seem to have been the first real settlers that would make a colony of their own when they arrived. Anybody else that visited North America or explored in this realm, they came, they saw, they made a mess, whatever the case, but they left, and the Dutch remained. To hear these tales from that time and to understand that culture from that era, it's
and the influence, right, on American culture. We wouldn't have donuts, we wouldn't have coleslaw, we wouldn't have Santa Claus.
By the way, this year at the Canadian National Exhibition, I will be serving slaw donuts. Every year they have a strange food. Coleslaw and donuts, a tribute to the Dutch. Please don't hesitate to pick yours up.
You put them together. Hey, and we like to beat our own drum, but the French were sort of settling up north, and the Spanish were settling Florida, and maybe the English sort of came. But you know what? The English took New Netherland from the Dutch in 1664, but they let the Dutch keep their own traditions, their own faith, their own religion, their own culture, and their own relationships with the Native Americans, which were on the whole very good. There have been some incidents where it worked out less to the advantage of the two groups, but on the whole, there was a strong trading relationship between the two groups.
Today's interview is no exception. Every single podcast, I will vouch for this. I'm amazed. The guests that you have on to talk about Dutch culture, the Netherlands, travel, food, all of these topics in the last 12 episodes have been fascinating. I implore you to go back in time now and check out the videos if you haven't of the previous podcasts. I'll also take a second and toot your horn if you don't mind, Tom. There is Dutch culture among us everywhere. Hiding in Plain Sight is the name of the book, a collection of amazing essays written by Tom Bivet. And
yeah, and I do touch on the New Netherland topic that we covered today as well. So in that book, there's 4 or 5 articles on that period. And
of course, DutchTheMedia.com, a good place to touch down and look in on a number of great publications and in fact, even watch over this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And Tom, thank you for a great guest and a great show again today. And we'll catch you next time on Dutch the Podcast.
See you next time, Mike.